I, Dr. Rakesh from USA, welcome all of you. The age of Elizabeth, 1550 to 1620. History of the period. Political summary. In the age of Elizabeth, all doubt seems to vanish from English history after the reign of Edward and Mary. With defeat and humiliation abroad, and persecutions and rebellion at home, the accession of a popular sovereign was like the sunrise after a long night, and in Milton's words, we suddenly see England, a noble and puissant nation, rousing herself like a strong man after sleep, and shaking her invincible locks with the Queen's character, a strange mingling of frivolity and strength, which reminds one of that iron image with feet of clay. We have nothing whatever to do. It is the national life that concerns the literary student, since even beginner must notice that any great development of the national life is invariably associated with a development of the national literature. It is enough for our purpose, therefore, to point out that Elizabeth, with all her vanity and inconsistency, steadily loved England and England's greatness. That she inspired all her people with the unbounded patriotism which exerts in Shakespeare, and with the personal devotion which finds a voice in the Fairy Queen. Under her administration, the English national life progressed by gigantic leaps rather than by slow historical process, and English literature reached the very highest point of its development. It is possible to indicate only a few general characteristics of this great age which had a direct bearing upon its literature. Characteristics of the Elizabethan age. The most characteristic feature of the age was the comparative religious tolerance, which was due largely to the Queen's influence. The frightful excess of the religious war, known as the 30 Years' War on the continent, found no parallel in England. Upon her accession, Elizabeth found the whole kingdom divided against itself. The north was largely Catholic, while the southern countries were as strongly Protestant. Scotland had followed the Reformation in its own intense way, while Ireland remained true to its old religious traditions. and both countries were openly rebellious. The court, made up of both parties, witnessed the rival intrigues of those who sought to gain the royal favor. It was due partly to the intense absorption of men's minds in religious questions that the preceding century, though age of advancing learning, produced scarcely any literature worthy of the name. Elizabeth favored both Catholic and Protestants, acting together as trusted counselors of the great sovereign. The defeat of the Spanish Armada established the Reformation as effect in England and at the same time united all Englishmen in a magnificent national enthusiasm. For the first time, tolerance seemed to be settled, and the mind of man, freed from religious fears and persecutions, turned with a great creative impulse to other forms of activity. It is partly from this new freedom of mind that the age of Elizabeth received its great literary stimulus. It was an age of comparative social contentment in strong contrast with the days of Langland. The rapid increase of manufacturing towns gave employment to the thousands who had before been idle and discontented. Increasing trade brought enormous wealth to England, and this wealth was shared to this extent at least that for the first time some systematic care for the needy was attempted. Parishes were made responsible for their own poor, and the wealthy were taxed to support them or give them employment. The increase of wealth, the improvement in living, the opportunities for labor, the new social content, there also are factors which help to account for the new literary activity. It is an age of drama, of adventure, of unbounded enthusiasm, springing from the new lands of fabulous riches revealed by English explorers. Drag sails around the world, shaping the mighty course which England colonizers shall follow through the centuries, and presently the young philosopher Bacon is saying confidently, I have taken all knowledge for my province. The mind must search farther than the eye. With new rich lands open to the sight, the imagination must create new forms to people the new words. Hakluyt's famous collection of voyagers and purchase his premises were even more stimulating to the English imagination than to the English acquisitiveness. While our explorers search the new word for the fountain of youth, our poets are creating literary works that are young forever. Marston writes, why men all their dripping pens are pure gold. The prisoners they take are fettered in gold, and as for rubies and diamonds, they go forth on holidays and gather them by the to hang on their children's cots. This comes nearer to being a description of Shakespeare's poetry than of the Indians in Virginia. Prospero in the Tempest, with his control over the mighty powers and harmonies of nature, is only the literature dream of that science which had just begun to grapple with the forces of the universe. Cabot, Drake, Frobisher, Gilbert, Raleigh, Willoughby, Hawkins, a score of explorers reveal a new earth to man's eyes, and instantly literature creates a new heaven to match it. So dreams and deeds increase side by side, and the dream is ever greater than the deed. That is the meaning of literature. To sum up, the age of Elizabethan was a time of intellectual liberty, of growing intelligence and comfort among all classes, of unbounded patriotism and of peace at home and abroad. For a Augustus in Rome, or go forward a little to the magnificent court of the Louis XVI and Cardinal Racine and Molière brought the drama in France to the point where Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Johnson had left in England half a century earlier. Such an age of great thought and great action, appealing to the eyes as well as the imagination and intellect, finds but one adequate literary expression. Neither poetry nor the story can express the whole man, his thought, feeling, action, and the resulting character. Hence, in the age of Elizabeth, literature and turned instinctively to the drama and brought it rapidly to the highest phase of its development. The non-dramatic poets of the Elizabethan age. Edmund Spenser, 1552 to 1599. Pyres, I have piped ears so long with pain that all mine autumn reeds been rent and wore, and my poor muse hath spent her spared store, yet little good hath got, and much less gain. Such pleasance makes the grasshopper so poor, and ligge so laid when winter doth her strain. The dapper ditties that I want to devise to feed youth's fancy and the flocking fry, delight and much what I the bet for thee. They hand the pleasure, I a slender price. I beat the bush, the birds to them to fly. What good thereof to die then arise? Can arise? Caddy the praise is better than the price. The glory eke moves greater than the gain. Shepherd's Calendar, October. In these words, with their sorrowful suggestions of decor, Spenser reveals his own heart. Unconsciously, perhaps, as no biographer could possibly do. His life and work seem to concentre about three greater influences, summed up in three names. Cambridge, where he grew acquainted with the classics and the Italian poets. London, where he experienced the glamour, appointment of court life. And Ireland, which steeped him in the beauty and imagery of old Celtic poetry and first gave him leisure to write his masterpiece. Life of Spenser's early life and passenger we know little, except that he was born in East Smithfield near the Tower of England, London, and was poor. He, his education began at the Merchant Taylor's School in London and was continued in Cambridge. Whether as a poor Caesar and fag for a wealthy student, he earned a scant living. Here in the glorious world that only a poor scholar knows how to create for himself, he read the classics, made acquaintance with the great Italian poets, and wrote numberless little poems of his own. Through Chaucer was his beloved master. His ambition was not to rival the contemporary tales, but rather to express the dream of English chivalry, much as Aristo had done for Italy in Orlando Furioso. After leaving Cambridge in 1576, Spenser went to the north of England on some unknown work or guest. Here, his chief occupation was to fall in love and to record his melancholy over the lost Rosalind in the Shepherd Calendar. Upon his friend Harvey's advice, and there he met Leicester, then at the height of royal favor, and they later took him to live at Leicester House. Here he finished the Shepherd calendar, and here he met Sydney and all Queen's favourites. The court was full of intrigues, lying, and flattery and splendour, and Spencer's opinion of his own uncomfortable position is best expressed in a few lines from Mother Hubbard's tale. Full little knowledge though has not tried what hell it is, ensuing long to bide, days and that might be better spent to waste long nights in pensive discontent, to fret thy soul with crosses and with cares, to hear the hearts to the comfortless despairs, to fawn, to crouch, to wait, to ride, to run, to spend, to give, to want, to be undone. In 1580, through Leicester's influence, Spencer, who was utterly weary of his dependent position, was made secretary to Lord Grey, the Queen's deputy in Ireland, and the third period of his life began. He accompanied his chief through one campaign of savage brutality in putting down an Irish rebellion, and was given an immense estate with the cost of Kilcolman in Munster, which had been confiscated from Earl Desmond, one of the Irish leaders. His life here, where according to the terms of his grant he must reside as an English settler, he regarded as lonely exile. My luckless lot that banished had myself like weight forlorn into that waste where I was quite forgot. It is interesting to note here a gentle poet's view of the unhappy island. After nearly 16 years residence, he wrote his view of the state of Ireland in 1596. His only prose work in which he submits a plan for pacifying the oppressed and rebellious people. This was to bring a huge force of cavalry and infantry into the country, give the Irish a brief time to submit, and after that to hunt them down like wild beasts. He calculated that cold, famine, and sickness would help the work of the sword, and that after the rebels had been well hounded for 2 winters and following summer would the subjects of several books find the country peaceful. This plan from the poets of harmony and beauty was somewhat milder than the usual treatment of a brave people whose offense was that they loved liberty and rebellion and religion. Strange as it may seem, the view was considered most statesmanlike and was excellently well received in England. In Kilcolman, surrounded by great natural beauty, Spencer finished the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen. In 1589, Religue visited him, heard the poem with enthusiasm, hurried the poet to London and presented him to Elizabeth. The first 3 books met with instant success when published and were acclaimed as the greatest work in the English language. A yearly pension of £50 was conferred by Elizabeth but rarely paid, and the poet turned back to the exile, that is, to Ireland again. Soon after his return, Spencer fell in love with his beautiful Elizabeth, an Irish girl, wrote his Amoreti or sonnet in her honor, and afterwards represented her in the Fairy Queen as the beautiful woman dancing among the graces. In 1594 he married Elizabeth. celebrating his wedding with his epithalamion, one of the most beautiful wedding hymns in any language. Spencer's visit to London was in 1595 when he published Astrophel and Elegy on the death of his friend Sidney, and three Leicester's house, now occupied by the new favourite Essex, where he probably met Shakespeare and the other literary lights of the Elizabethan age. Soon after his return to Ireland, Spencer was appointed Sheriff of Cork, a queer office for a poet, which probably brought about his undoing. The same year, Tyrone's rebellion broke out in Munster. Kilcolman, the ancient house of Desmond, was one of the first places attacked by the rebel, and Spencer barely escaped with his wife and two children. It is supposed that some unfinished parts of the Fairy Queen were burned in the of his frightful experience. Spencer never recovered. He returned to England heartbroken, and in the following year, 1599, he died in an at Westminster. According to Ben Jonson, he died for want of bread. But whether that is a poetic way of saying that he had lost his property or that he actually died of destitution will probably never be known. He was buried beside his master Chaucer in Westminster Abbey, the poets of that age thronging to his funeral, and according to Camden, casting their elegies and pens that had written them into his tomb. Spencer's works. The Fairy Queen is the great work upon which the poet's fame chiefly rests. The original plan of the poem included 24 books, each of which was to recount the adventure and triumph of a knight who represented a moral value. Spencer's purpose, as indicated in a letter to Rilke which introduces the poem, is as follows: to portray in Arthur before he was a king the image of a brave knight, perfected in the 12 private moral virtues as Aristotle hath. The purpose of these first 12 books, which if I find to be well accepted, I may be perhaps encouraged to frame the other part of the politic virtues in his person after that he came to be king. Each of the virtues appears as a knight, fighting its opposing vice, and the poem tells the story of the conflicts. It is therefore purely allegorical, not only in its personified virtues, but also in its representations of life as a struggle between good and evil. In its strong moral element, the poem differs radically from Orlando Furioso, upon which it was modeled. Spencer completed only 6 books celebrating holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, and courtesy. We have also a fragment of the 7th treating of constancy, but the rest of his book was not written or else was lost in the fire of Kilcolman. The first 3 books are by far the best, and judging by the way interest lags and the allegory grows incomprehensible, it is perhaps as well for Spencer's reputation that the other 18 books remained a dream. Argument of the Fairy Queen. From the introductory letter, we learn that the hero visits the Queen's court in Fairyland while she is holding a 12 days festival. On each day, some distressed person appears unexpectedly, tells a woeful story of dragons, of enchantments, or of distressed beauty or virtue, and asks for a champion to right the wrong and to let the oppressed go free. Sometimes a knight volunteers or begs for the dangerous mission. Again, the duties assigned by the queen and the journeys and adventures of these knights are the subjects of the several books. The first recounts the adventures of the Red Cross Knight representing holiness, the Lady Yuna representing religion, and their contests are symbolical of the worldwide struggle between virtue and faith on the one hand and sin hearsay on the other. The second book tells the story of Sir Gawain or Temperance, the third of Britomartis representing chastity, the fourth, fifth, and sixth of the Campbell and Tremont friendship, article justice, and Sir Cadior courtesy. Spencer's plan was a very elastic one, and he filled up the measure of his narrative with everything that caught his fancy. Historical events and personages under allegorical masks, beautiful ladies, chivalrous knights, giants, monsters, dragons, sirens, enchanters, and adventures. Enough to stock a library of fiction. If you read Homer or Virgil, you know his subject in the first strong line. If you read Cadamon's paraphrase or Milton's epic, the introduction gives you the theme, but Spencer's great poem, with the exception of single line in the prologue, fire, wars, and faithful loves shall moralize my song, gives hardly a hint of what is coming. As to the meaning of the allegorical figures, one is generally in doubt. In the first three books, the shadowy fairy queen sometimes represents the glory of God, and sometimes Elizabeth, who was naturally flattered by the parallel. Bryomartis is also Elizabeth. The Red Cross Knights is Sydney, the model Englishman Arthur, who always appears to rescue the oppressed in Leicester, which is another outrageous flattery. Una is sometimes religion, and sometimes the Protestant Church, while D'Souza represents Mary Queen of Scots or general Catholicism. In the last three books, Elizabeth appears again as Marcella, Henry IV of France as Bourbon, the war in Netherlands as the story of Lady Belge, Religue as Timmy's, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, lovers of Mary or D'Souza as Blandmore and Perridale, and as so on through the wide range of contemporary characters and events, till the allegory becomes as difficult to follow as the set of the Gothe's fast. Poetical form. For the fairy queen, Spencer invented a new verse form which has been called since his day and Spenserian stanza. Because of its rare beauty, it has been much used by nearly all our poets in their best work. The new stanza was an improved form of Ariosto's Ottawa Rima, and bears a close resemblance to one of the Chaucer's most musical verse forms in the Monk's Tale. Spencer's stanza is in 9 lines, 8 of 5 feet each and the last of 6 feet, rhyming A, B, B, C, B, C, C. A few selections from the first book, which is best worth reading, are reproduced here to show the style and melody of the verses. A gentle knight was pricking on the plain. Jailard in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dints of deep wounded did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody fields. Yet arms still that time did he never wield. His angry steed did chide his foaming build, as much disdaining to the cube to the yield. Full oily night he seemed, and fair did strid, as one fortnightly glust and fires encounters fit, and on his breast a bloody cross he bore, the dear remembrance of his dying Lord, for whose sweet shack the glorious buzz he wore, and dead as living ever him adored. Upon his shield the like was also scored, for sovereign hope which in his help he had, right, faithful, true he was in deed and word, but of his tears did seem to Solomon had, yet nothing did he dread but even were yet. This sleepy bit from the dwelling of Morpheus invites us to linger, and more to lull him in his slumber so, a trickling stream from high rock lumbering down, and ever dazzling rain upon the loft, mixed with a murmuring wind which like the song of swarming bees did cast him in a swan. The description of Yuna shows the poet's sense of ideal beauty. Minor poems next to the masterpiece, The Shepherd's Calendar 1579, is the best known of Spenser's poems. Though as his first work it is below many others in melody. It consists of 20 it consists of 12 pastoral poems or eclogues, one for each month of the year. The themes are generally rural life, nature, love in friends, love in fields, and the speakers are shepherds and shepherdesses. To increase effect, Spenser uses strange forms of speech and obsolete words to such an extent that Johnson complained his works are not English or any other language. Some are melancholy poems on his lost Rosalind, some are satires on the clergy. One, The Briar and the Oak, is an allegory. One flatters Elizabeth, and the others are pure fables touched with the Puritan spirit. They are written in various styles and meters, and show plainly that Spenser was practicing and preparing himself for greater work. Other noteworthy poems are Mother Hubbard's Tale, a satire on society, Astrophel, an elegy on the death of Sidney, Amoreti or sonnets to his Elizabeth, the marriage hymn, Epithalamion, and four hymns on love, beauty, heavenly love, and heavenly beauty. There are numerous other poems and collections of poems, but these show the scope of his work and are best worth reading. Importance of the Shepherd's Calendar. The publication of this work in 1579 by an unknown writer who signed himself Modesti Amorito marks an important epoch in our literature. We shall appreciate this better if we remember the long years during which England had been without a great poet. Chaucer and Spenser are often studied together as poets of the Renaissance period, and the idea prevails that they were almost contemporary. In fact, nearly 2 centuries passed after Chaucer's death, years of enormous political and intellectual development, And not only did Chaucer have no successor, but our language had changed so rapidly that Englishmen had lost the ability to read his lines correctly. This first published work of Spenser is noteworthy in at least four respects. First, it, it marks the appearance of the first national poet in 2 centuries. Second, it shows again the variety and melody of English verse, which had been largely a tradition since Chaucer. Third, it was our first pastoral, the beginning of a long series of English pastoral compositions modelled on Spenser and as such exerted a strong influence on subsequent literature. And fourth, it marks the real beginning of the outburst of great Elizabeth poetry. Characteristics of Spenser's poetry. Characteristics of Spenser's poetry. The five main qualities of Spenser's poetry are a perfect melody, heroes, knights, ladies, dwarfs, demons and dragons, classic mythology, stories of chivalry, and the thronging ideals of the Renaissance, all passing in gorgeous procession across an ever-changing and ever-beautiful landscape. A lofty moral purity and seriousness. A delicate idealism which could make all nature and every common thing beautiful. In contrast with these excellent qualities, the reader will probably note the strange appearance of his lines due to his fondness for obsolete words like "aini" means eyes and "shand" means shame, and his tendency to coin others like "mercify" to suit his own purpose. It is Spenser's identity and his executive melody which have caused him to be known as the poet's poet. Nearly all our subsequent singers acknowledge their delight in him and their indebtedness. Macaulay alone critics voices a fault which all who are not poets quickly feel, namely that with all Spenser's excellences he is difficult to read. The modern man loses himself in the confused allegory of the fairy queen, skips all but the marked passages and softly closes the book in gentle weariness. Even of his longer poems, while of exquisite work, manship and delightfully melodious, generally fail to hold the reader's attention. The moment is languid. There is little dramatic interest and only a suggestion of humor. The very melody of his verses sometimes grow monotonous, like a Strauss waltz, too long continued. We shall best appreciate Spenser by reading at first only a few well-chosen selections from the Fairy Queen and the Shepherd's Calendar and a few of the minor poems which exemplify his wonderful melody. Comparison between Chaucer and Spenser. At the outset, it is well to remember that though Spenser regarded Chaucer as his master, 2 centuries intervenes between them and their writings have almost nothing in common. We shall appreciate this better by a brief comparison between our first two modern poets. Chaucer was a combined poet and man of affairs, with the latter predominating, though dealing largely with ancient or medieval material. He has a curiously modern way of looking at life. Indeed, he is our only author preceding Shakespeare with whom we feel thoroughly at home. He threw aside the outgrown material romance, which was practically the only form of narrative in his day, invented the arts of storytelling in verse and brought it to a degree of perfection which has probably never since been equaled. Though a student of the classics, he lived wholly in the present, studied the men and women of his own time, painted them as they were, but added always a touch of kindly humor or romance to make them more interesting. So his mission appears to be simply to amuse themselves, himself and his readers. His mastery of various and melodious verse was marvelous and has never been surpassed in our language. But the English of his day was changing rapidly, and in a very few years, men were unable to appreciate his art, so that even to Spencer and Dryden, for example, he seemed deficient in metrical skill. On this account, his influence on our literature has been much less than we should expect from the quality of his work and from his position as one of the greatest of English poets. Like Chaucer, Spencer was a busy man of affairs, but in him the poet, the scholar, always predominates. He writes as the idealist, describing men not as they are but as he thinks they should be. He has no humor and his mission is not to amuse but to reform. Like Chaucer, he studies the classics and contemporary French and Italian writers, but instead of adapting his material to present day conditions, he makes poetry, as in his eclogues, for instance, more artificial even than his phone models, where Chaucer looks about him and describes life as he sees it. Spencer always looks backward for his inspiration. He lives dreamily in the past. He lives dreamily in the past in a realm of purely imagined adventures. His first quality is imagination, not observation. And he is the first of our poets to create a world of dreams, fancies, and illusions. His second quality is a wonderful sensitiveness to beauty, which shows itself not only in its subject manner of his poetry. Like Chaucer, he is an almost perfect workman. But in reading Chaucer, we think chiefly of his natural character or his ideas. While in reading Spencer, we think of the beauty of expression. The exquisite Spencerian stanza and the rich melody of Spencer have made him the model of all our modern poets. Minor poets, though Spencer is the one great non-dramatic poet of the Elizabethan age, a multitude of minor poets demand attention of this would understand the tremendous literary activity of the period. One needs only to read the Paradise of Dainty Devices in 1576 or a gorgeous gallery of gallant inventions in 1578 or any other of the miscellaneous collections to find hundreds of songs, many of them of exquisite workmen, he poets by poets whose names now awaken no response. A glance is enough to assure one that over all England the sweet spirit of song had arisen like the first chirping of birds after a storm. Nearly 200 poems are recorded in the short period from 1558 to 1655, and many of them were prolific writers. In a work like this, we can hardly do more than mention a few of the best known writers and spend a moment at least with the works that suggest Marlowe's description of infinite riches in a little room. The reader will note for himself the interesting union of action, though in these men so characteristic of the Elizabethan age, for most of them were engaged chiefly in business or war or politics, and literature was to them a pleasant recreation rather than an absorbing profession. Thomas Sackville in 1536 to 1608. Sir Thomas Sackville, Earl of Dorset and Lord High Treasurer of England, is generally classed with Watt and Surrey. Among the predecessors of the Elizabethan age, in imitation of Dante's Inferno, Sackville formed the design of a great poem called The Mirror for Magistrates under guidance of an allegorical personage called Sorrow. He meets the spirits of all the important actors in English history. The idea was to follow Lydgate's fall of princes and let each character tell his own story, so that the poem would be a mirror in which present rulers might see themselves and read this warning: who reckless rules right soon may hope to rue. Sackville finished only the intro, the induction, and the complaint of the Duke of Buckingham. These are written in the rhyme royal and are marked by strong poetic feeling and expression. Unfortunately, Sackville turned from poetry to politics, and the poem was carried on by two inferior poets, William Baldwin and George Ferris. Sackville wrote also in connection with Thomas Norton, the first English tragedy, Ferex and Porrex, called also Gorboduc, which will be considered in the following section on the rise of the drama. Philip Sidney in 1554 to 1586. Sidney, the ideal gentleman, the Sir Calidore of Spenser's Legend of Courtesy, is vastly more interesting as a man than a writer, and the student is recommended to read his biography rather than his books. His life expresses better than any single literary work the two ideals of the age: personal honor and national greatness. As a writer, he is known by three principal works, all published after his death, showing how little importance he attached to his own writing. Even while he was encouraging Spenser, the Arcudi is a pastoral romance interspersed with eclogues in which shepherds and shepherdesses sing of the delights of rural life. Though it was taken up idly as a summer's pastime, it became immensely popular and was imitated by 100 poets. Apology for Poetry in 1590, generally called The Defense of Poesy, appeared in answer to a pamphlet by Stephen Gosson called The School of Abuse 1579, in which the poetry of the age and its unbridled pleasure were denounced by the Puritan thoroughness and conviction. The Apology is one of the first critical essays in English, and though its style now seems labored and unnatural, the perennial result of Euphues and his school, it is still one of the best expression of the place and meaning of poetry in any language. Astrophel and Stella is a collection of songs and sonnets addressed to Lady Penelope Devereux, to whom Sidney had once been betrothed. They abound in exquisite lines and passages containing more poetic feelings and expression than the songs of any other minor poets of the age, minor writers of the age. George Chapman in 1559 to 1634. Chapman spent his long, quiet life among the dramatists and wrote chiefly for the stage. His plays, which were for the most part merely poems in dialogue, fell far below the high dramatic standard of his time and are now almost unread. His most famous work is the metrical translation of the Iliad in 1611 and of the Odyssey in 1614. Chapman's Homer, though lacking the simplicity and dignity of the original, has a force and rapidity of movement which makes it superior in many respects to Pope's more familiar translation. Chapman is remembered also as the finisher of Marlowe's Hero and Leander, in which, apart from the drama, the Renaissance movement is seen at perhaps its highest point in English poetry. Out of scores of long poems of the period, Hero and Leander and the Fairy Queen are the only two which are even slightly known to modern readers. Michel Drayton, 1563 to 1631. Drayton is the most voluminous and to antiquarian, at least the most interesting of the minor poets. He is the layman of the Elizabethan age and vastly more scholarly than his predecessor. His chief work is Polyolbion, an enormous poem of many thousand couplets describing the towns, mountains and rivers of Britain with the interesting legends connected with each. It is an extremely valuable work and represents a lifetime of study and research. Two other long works are the Baroness Wars and the Heroic Epistle of England. And besides, these were many minor poems. One of the best of these is the Ballad of Azincourt, a ballad written in the lively meter which Tennyson used. The origin of the drama. First the deed, then the story, then the play. That seems to be the natural development of the drama in its simplest form. Are treasured in its literature and later nations represent in play or pantomime certain parts of the story which appeal most powerfully to the imagination. Among primitive races, the deeds of their gods and heroes are often represented at the early festivals, and among children whose instinct artificial habits. One sees the story that was heard at bedtime, repeated next day in vigorous action when our boys turn scouts and our girls princess. Precisely as our first dramatists turned to the old legends and heroes of Britain for their first stage productions. To act a part seems as natural to humanity as to tell a story, and originally the drama is but an old story retold to the a story put into action by living performers who for the moment put into action by living performers make believe or imagine themselves to be old heroes. To illustrate the matter simply, there was a great life lived by him who was called the Christ. Inevitably, the life found its way into literature, and we have the Gospels, Around the life and literature sprang up a great religion. Its worship was at first simple, the common prayer, the evening meal together, and remembered words of the Master, and the choosing hymns. Gradually a ritual was established with which grew more elaborate and impressive as the centuries went by. Scenes from the master's life began to be represented in the churches, especially at Christmas time when the story of Christ's birth was made more effective to the eyes of the people who could not read, by a baby in surrounded by magi and shepherds, with a choir of angels chanting the Gloria in excelsis. Other impressive scenes from the Gospel followed. Then the Old Testament was called upon until a complete cycle of plays from the creation to the final judgment was established, and we have the mysteries and miracle plays of the Middle Ages. Out of these came directly the Elizabethan age. Periods in the development of the drama. The religious period in Europe as in Greece. The drama had a distinctively religious origin. The first characters were drawn from the New Testament, and the object of the first plays was to make the church service more impressive, or to emphasize moral lessons by showing the reward of the good and the punishment of the evildoer. In the later days of the Roman Empire, the church found the stage possessed by frightful plays, which debased the morals of a people already fallen too low. Reform seemed impossible. The corrupt drama was driven from the stage, and plays of every kind were forbidden. But mankind loved spectacles, and soon the church itself provided a substitute for the forbidden plays in the famous mysteries and miracles. Miracle and mystery plays. In France, the name miracle was given to any play representing the lives of the saints, while the mystery represented scenes from the life of Christ or stories from the Old Testament associated with the coming of Messiah. In English, this distinction was almost unknown. The name miracle was used indiscriminately for all plays having their origin in the Bible or in the lives of the saints, and the name mystery to distinguish a certain class of plays was not used until long after the religious drama had passed away. The earliest miracle of which we have any record in England is the Lundus de Sancta Catharina, which was performed in Dunstable about the year 1110. It is not known who wrote the original play of Saint Catherine, but our first version was prepared by Geoffrey of Saint Albans, a French school teacher of Dunstable. Whether or not the play was given in England is not known, but it was customary in the earliest plays for the chiefs to speak in Latin or French to show their importance, while minor and comic parts of the same play were given in England in English. Thanks for listeners, those who are listening carefully about the literary giants, those who have represented themselves in the form of creators, operators, and generators of the healthy generation. I thank again Dr.RK from USA. Thanks for listening and learning from Holy words.